Thank you so much for coming. My name is Deborah Polsky. I'm the Executive Director of the Dallas Jewish Historical Society, and we are delighted to welcome you here tonight for the second in our Jim Schwartz annual lecture series. Although our series has been ongoing for well over 10 years, bringing in locally and nationally known speakers on subjects of interest to the Dallas community, thanks to a generous donor, we were able to rename our series this year in honor of Jim Schwartz of blessed memory, the immediate past president of the Society. A strong leader and a good friend, Jim Schwartz is remembered for the remarkable strides made at the Dallas Jewish Historical Society during his 4-year tenure as president, maintaining strong fiscal responsibility, offering meaningful and successful programs and fundraising events, and being instrumental in moving the organization forward in delivering full archival digitization. Best known for his warmth and his Menschlichkeit, as well as his dedication to the growth of the Dallas Jewish Historical Society, we're thrilled to have this opportunity to honor Jim with this annual series of lectures. Tonight's program, and we welcome his family and friends who are here tonight with us, as well as all the rest of you. Tonight's program introduces us to Mark Stuertz, a nationally award-winning journalist and author who has been a Dallas-based writer for more than 2 decades. His investigative reporting, features, criticism, and business process articles have appeared in a variety of publications, including the Dallas Observer, Modern Luxury Dallas, the Dallas Business Journal, Dapper, and Texas Monthly. He's also contributed to national publications, including American Way, Spirit, Food and Wine, Wine Enthusiast, you want to hear more about that, Wine Business Monthly, Private Air, and American Driver. And with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Mark to tell us about Secret Dallas.
Thank you very much, Deborah. And thank you for all who came tonight. I really appreciate it.
We're going to hit the lights.
Looking up a little far from there.
Closer? Okay. Is that good? Everyone can hear? Well, thank you. The Jewish community in Dallas has a long and storied history. Eastern European and German Jewish immigrants began settling in the area in the 19th century, both to escape the revolutionary chaos in Germany and the pogroms of Tsarist Russia. They settled in areas like South Dallas, in Deep Ellum, where they forged ties with African-American freedmen, and in a neighborhood just north of downtown that was bound by McKinney Avenue to the east, the Katy Railroad tracks to the west, and Hall Street to the north. They established the first Jewish cemetery in 1854 and the first congregation, Temple Emmanuel, formerly known as Congregation Emmanuel, in 1873. They established some of the most iconic enterprises in the city, including Neiman Marcus, Sanger Brothers, and Harrison Company. What follows are just a few of the elements of the city where their influence was most profoundly felt, plus a few pieces of trivia and history that I hope you find interesting. This is St. Anne's School, as it stood in the early 1960s. St. Anne's was built in 1927 as an elementary school for girls. It was the first such institution in Dallas that established exclusively for Hispanic children. It was a centerpiece, along with the long ago raised Our Lady of Guadalupe Church, of cultural life in a neighborhood called Little Mexico. Now, Little Mexico is that area north of downtown that was bounded by McKinney, the railroad tracks, and Hall Street. But before this area was Little Mexico, it was known as Little Jerusalem, after it was settled by Polish Jewish immigrants who were escaping the pogroms in Eastern Europe. The complexion of the neighborhood changed in 1910 after the area began absorbing Mexican immigrants who were escaping the tumult of the Mexican Revolution. One of the elements of this neighborhood is Pike Park, named after Edgar Pike, a Jewish jeweler who married into the Sanger family. This neighborhood also butted up against what was then a city-sanctioned red light district between 1910 and 1913, known as Frogtown. This image is from 1913, right around the time after the sanctioning ended. It was called Frogtown on account of the croaking frogs that swam upstream the Trinity River and settled on the riverbanks on the edge of downtown. The construction of the Woodall-Rogers Freeway and the North Dallas Tollway in the 1980s leveled much of Little Mexico. St. Anne's was only saved after it was named a Dallas landmark in 1998. And shortly thereafter, well-known developer Gabriel Barbier-Mueller, I hope I pronounced that right, and his firm, Harwood International, began slowly buying up property in the neighborhood. He purchased St. Anne's in 2007 and transformed it into a restaurant and bar. It's on Harry Hines. In 2012, he established the Samurai Collection, a museum he established above the restaurant that features his collection of Japanese armor. The collection contains thousands of artifacts, including helmets, masks, horse armor, and weaponry. St. Anne's represents the last remaining early 20th century Mexican Catholic institution in the city. Now, does everyone know who this gentleman is? This is Abraham Zapruder, Ukrainian Jewish immigrant and manufacturer of ladies' dresses. He created what is perhaps the most famous 20 seconds of film in history. On November 22nd, 1963, he left his offices in the Daltex building, which is now a museum gift shop, across the street from the school book depository with his Bell & Howell Zoomatic 8mm camera. He had hoped to capture President Kennedy as he cruised by in his motorcade. "They killed him," he screamed to fellow spectators after he observed a shot strike the president through his viewfinder. He was one of the first people to know that he was dead because he saw it the split second it happened. But it's possible that film may have never been captured because if it weren't for Zapruder's secretary, actually, because though he intended to bring his camera to work that day, when he awoke that morning, he thought the weather too gloomy to get good footage, so he left his camera at home. But by midday, the weather brightened, and his secretary convinced him to go home and retrieve it. Zapruder sold the rights to his 27 seconds of film to Life magazine for $150,000. 25,000 of which he donated to the widow of Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit, who was killed 45 minutes after the assassination by Lee Harvey Oswald. Zapruder died in 1970 of cancer and was laid to rest at Temple Emmanuel Cemetery. The American people didn't get to see the Zapruder film until 12 years later, after it was filmed in March of 1975, when it was broadcast on ABC's Good Night America, hosted by Geraldo Rivera. In 1999, the US government awarded the Zapruder family $16 million for their use of the film over the preceding decades. The family donated the rights to the film to the 6th floor museum. Deep Ellum has a colorful history, one rich in blues, jazz, lively nightclubs, pawn shops, pot, and booze. The neighborhood has spawned a number of successful musical acts, including Edie Brickell and the New Bohemians, Erykah Badu, and the Old 97s. In the early 1900s, an African community developed with a rich musical heritage, one that boasted a culture similar to Harlem in New York. Alongside this African-American community was a thriving Jewish population who launched and operated dozens of businesses in the neighborhood. This amalgam of lively African-American culture and Jewish enterprise drew Dallasites from all over the city seeking entertainment and bargains. Honest Joe's Pawn Shop, operated by Reuben Goldstein, was one of the most colorful emporia in the neighborhood. The tune Take a Whiff on Me by bluesman Huddie Leadbelly Ledbetter was one of the first popular songs to use the word Elm in reference to Elm Street. The moniker is a combination of African-American slang and the phonetic spelling of elm by Eastern European Jewish immigrants, E-L-L-U-M. Deep Ellum was also the setting for a 1960 feature film called All the Fine Young Cannibals. Cannibals starred Natalie Wood and Robert Wagner in their first cinematic work together as husband and wife. They played a pair of dirt-poor East Texas farmers who strike it rich in New York after establishing their fates in Deep Ellum. The movie was a bomb. It got terrible reviews in the Dallas Morning News and the New York Times, and it barely made more than its $1.64 million production budget. You won't find this movie today on Netflix or on Amazon Prime, nor in circulation on any of the movie channels. I got my copy from an obscure website, and the DVD was obviously reproduced from an old VHS tape. In the lower right-hand corner, it said, Turner Classic Movies. This is the Statler Hotel. It was the first hotel with elevator music and a television set in every room. A Dallas landmark, the Statler opened in 1956 and was completed at a cost of $16 million. It boasted 1,000 guest rooms and a ballroom that could accommodate 2,200. But the Statler had a beleaguered history. Statler Hotels went into insolvency in 1954, 2 years before this hotel opened. And Hilton, they sold their assets to Hilton for what was then a record $111 million. Hilton sold off the hotel in 1988, and in its waiting years, it was the Park-In Plaza and the Dallas Grand Hotel before it closed for good in 2001. Beset by water damage and vandalism, the hotel spent the next few years dodging demolition before developers took an interest. During one of its renovations, there was an amazing discovery. An old work by famed New York muralist Jack Lubin. It was discovered in the old hotel's Empire Room behind a brick wall that was erected during one of the hotel's renovations. After a 3-year, $230 million renovation by American Centurion Development, the hotel reopened in 2017. It features 200 luxury apartments to complement its 159 guest rooms, a far cry from its original stock. The front desk showcases the rediscovered and restored mural by Lubin, who died in 1986 at the age of 79. Does everyone know what this is? What this building is, this landmark? This is Woodrow Wilson High School, alma mater of such luminaries as Steve Miller of the Steve Miller Band, Dusty Hill, bassist for ZZ Top, race car driver and sports car developer Carroll Shelby, and pro football wide receiver and Hall of Famer Tim Brown. This landmark has an interesting cornerstone. For entombed in that cornerstone, which was laid in 1947, is a piece of wedding cake from the 1913 nuptials of Jessie Wilson, daughter of President Woodrow Wilson. That piece of cake made its way to Dallas via one of the bridesmaids, a Mrs. Charles Francis Bates, who sent it to her cousin in Dallas. No word on how that cake was preserved for 14 years. Incidentally, President Woodrow Wilson is infamously credited with reanimating the Ku Klux Klan in the early 20th century after he screened D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation in the White House in 1915. The Klan pretty much controlled Dallas City Hall and the Dallas Police Department during the 1920s, and in fact, the State Fair of Texas in 1923 actually celebrated the group. During that same period, the terrorist group harassed both African Americans and Jews in the city's ethnically diverse neighborhoods. On May 25th, 1908, Dallas was engulfed in 15 inches of rain. The next day, the Trinity River crested at 52.6 feet and a width of 1.5 miles. It killed 5 people and left 5,000 homeless out of a population of 90,000. It inflicted $2.5 million in damage, which is roughly the equivalent of $100 million in current dollars. In the early 20th century, the Trinity River coursed right up against downtown Dallas, and it made its foul presence known. During the hot summer months, the sluggish current of dark, stagnant liquid expelled stinking sulfurous gases. Those noxious odors, coupled with the constant threat of disease and flooding, added thrust to a movement to reroute the Trinity. That's when city officials enlisted the expertise of George Kessler, Jewish urban planner and landscape architect. Kessler designed Fair Park and was responsible for a new renewal blueprint called the Kessler Plan, which was published in 1911. The Kessler Plan called for the rerouting of the Trinity River and the construction of what would become Central Expressway. The Trinity rerouting was a massive undertaking. It was essentially a mini Panama Canal project. It called for 17 miles of river channels, the removal of 21 million cubic feet of earth, and the construction of 2 levees 25 feet high and 1,200 feet apart. The plan called for digging a straight 26-mile channel a half a mile and more east of its original course close to downtown. And you can see the contrast in the middle of the construction here, the channel there and the original course. It took until the late 1930s and $30 million to tame the Trinity River. And it unleashed 10,000 acres of level land for development right next to downtown. In anticipation of what was to be the navigability of the Trinity River, bridges above the river were built extra high to accommodate seagoing vessels destined for a port at Dallas. Of course, that port never came to pass. But city officials promised that by 2021, the land between the levees will be an urban park with pedestrian walkways, pedestrian bridges, and recreational paths, and water sports. Does anyone know who this gentleman is? This is Richard Speck, one of the most notorious mass murderers in history. Speck made his way to Dallas in the early 1950s as a boy, traveling from Monmouth, Illinois, with his widowed mother and stepfather. He gradually embarked on a life of petty crime, stealing cartons of cigarettes, cases of beer, and writing bad checks. He graduated to assault in 1965 when he attacked one Sarah Wadsworth on Junia Street as she made her way to her apartment at 2 a.m. in the morning. For this crime, Speck was sentenced to 490 days at Huntsville, both for the assault and for a parole violation. But due to a bureaucratic snafu, in Dallas, he was released 300 days early after only having served time for the parole violation. Then in January of 1966, a warrant was put out for his arrest after he assaulted a man with a knife at Ginny's Lounge, his favorite Dallas hangout. To help him escape arrest, his sister put him on a bus for Chicago, where he was to connect with family to help set him up with a job. In July of that year, he brutally murdered 8 student nurses from South Chicago Community Hospital. A 9th, bound and gagged, escaped his wrath by wriggling underneath a bed and holding her breath. She identified him at trial. Speck died in 1991 of a heart attack just a day shy of his 50th birthday while serving 8 consecutive life sentences at Stateville Correctional Center just outside of Chicago. His death sentence was overturned 20 years earlier in 1971 by the Supreme Court. In the 1920s, South Dallas was the most prominent Jewish community in the city. It featured shops, kosher delis, synagogues, and modest family homes like this one. In fact, I believe this image is from the Dallas Jewish Historical Society. What's that?
Liz Lehner's grandfather on the bicycle.
The 2-mile stretch of Forest Avenue, which is now Martin Luther King Boulevard, was one of the largest Jewish settlements in the South. But by 1956, the neighborhood was largely African American, after the Jewish population largely migrated to Preston Hollow and parts of North Dallas. But 7 years earlier, in 1949, the Forest Theater opened. Built as a link in the now defunct Interstate Theaters chain, the 1,500-seat theater opened to a raucous crowd of 5,000. In the early 1950s, it screened movies mostly for white and Jewish audiences, and in fact, it once served as a temporary synagogue. But the Forest closed in 1965. Over the years, there were revivals, and it featured acts such as Red Fox, Ike and Tina Turner, B.B. King, Erykah Badu, even Prince. But the Forest is queued up for resurrection. City Square, a nonprofit, recently purchased the theater with plans to turn it into an arts center. They plan on making flexible spaces out of the theater and its adjacent storefronts. And in fact, St. Philip's School and Community Center on Pennsylvania Avenue is also part of this project. They're going to be developing land near the overpasses on I-45 and turning it into an urban park with outdoor performance facilities and recreational facilities. The organization hopes to have the project completed by the end of 2019 in time for the theater's 70th anniversary. This complex of wooden resort cabins on White Rock Lake was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps during the Great Depression. But between 1944 and 1945, this CCC camp at Winfrey Point was a holding facility for German prisoners of war. How did White Rock Lake become a POW camp? Standards set by the 1929 Geneva Conventions mandated that POWs captured be interred in a climate similar to the one where they were captured. So out of the 230,000 German and Italian soldiers captured in North Africa, 80,000 made their way to Texas. Of those, 200 non-commissioned German officers from Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps made it to Camp White Rock Lake. After the war, virtually all of them were returned to Europe. And today, all that's left of that camp at Winfrey Point is this old fire hydrant between a softball field and a batting practice cage. And that concludes the presentation. Thank you very much. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer. I can.
Does the book have more than what you just told?
Yeah, there's 95 entries. 95 entries in total.
Keep going.
Yes.
I just wanted to comment that the Colombian Country Club, which was the Jewish country club in Dallas, used to be on Garland Road. And as a child, I remember hearing about the Nazi, or the camps.
Oh, really?
With the Nazi prisoners. Not far from there.
Yeah, it's amazing that there were 80,000 sent to Texas and only 200 made it to this area.
That's better.
Maybe most of them are sent to East Texas, I don't know.
In your research, do you have any knowledge of how or why Dallas became the largest Ku Klux Klan group in like 1960s? There was a huge resurgence of it again.
No. No, I know it was powerful in the 1920s, but I didn't know it was big in the 1960s as well.
The largest group in the country. I almost fainted when I heard that.
Wow.
Yeah. I
That's
just
a-
wondered if you knew anything that might have caused
No.
that, or anybody that was, like you said, Wilson was was credited for the first one, but.
Right, right. Yeah, that'd be something to research. I don't know. Honestly, don't know.
There are probably other people here who came from Chicago. My husband and I moved there the same week as the Speck murders and the Lady of Angels church fire, both at the same time. It was an amazing week in Chicago.
Oh, wow. Our Lady of the Angels Church fire. What was that? Was it?
A big church was burned. It had nothing to do with Speck
Right.
murders at the same time.
Were there people killed?
Yes.
Oh.
Do you know anything about the name Harwood? Is it, somebody told me that he was a Ku Klux Klan chief, and we have a street name after him.
Really? No, I don't. I'm afraid I don't. But that would be another point that would be interesting to pursue.
There was a lot of things on the founders of Dallas where they just came up with, I went to John Henry Brown, and he was a slave owner. They said, oh, he was a slave owner at the school. Well, they had already changed the name of it to, what's his name? No, it was changed to Billy E. Dade.
Oh, Billy Day.
Billy E. Dade. When it went black, Billy E. Dade was the first educator that was principal of that school. And I was just by there a couple days ago, and that building is sitting there so sad looking. Boarded up windows and stuff like that.
Where is that?
This is over on what's now Malcolm X and Park Road. It was Oakland and Park Road at the time. And Grand, the back of it's on Grand Avenue, which is another black leader.
Yeah.
Is named after. And they kind of abandoned that building and built a new one and called it a junior high, Billy E. Dade, over on Grand Avenue. But the sign on the front of the school still says Billy E. Dade. They had a 90th anniversary of the school when it was because it was built in 1912. And it cost $24,000.
Wow.
And yeah, they did a program. They had an open house. I had a friend that said, let's go, and we went. And those black kids outdid themselves performing for us. Then they had a thing in the auditorium. Boy, this auditorium sure got small. The years that had gone by. But there were many of the students that had gone, people that had gone to school there, were at that anniversary. of it, the 90th anniversary of the school?
Born in the late 80s, and so was kind of a younger kid in the mid-90s, and used to hear a lot about Deep Ellum and popular music that was being played down there, so on and so forth. And then there was a time in the early 2000s, I was in high school then, and I grew up north of Dallas, about 60 miles, but we used to sometimes come to Dallas for entertainment. But during the early 2000s, in that era, everybody said, oh, don't go to Deep Ellum, you don't want to go to Deep Ellum, it's dangerous down there, and all this. Well, now there has just been this complete resurgence, and Deep Ellum is, really thriving now. And it's actually expanded, blocks east and, farther down, more retail
Yeah, it's
and,
amazing.
bars and venues and stuff. Can you provide a little more insight, or do you have knowledge pertaining to, has Deep Ellum always kind of been this roller coaster type thing where it was a hustle bustle and then nobody wanted to be there, that was
Well,
a
they had the
hustle
trains
bustle?
that went through there until 1916, when they built Union Station. So it brought a
Yeah,
lot
there were
of people
railroad
into
tracks,
that
I know.
area.
But, yeah, I remember during the late 90s and the early 2000s, there was a lot of, because of all the bars and nightclubs, there was a lot of criminal activity
Well,
back
the
then.
homeless.
And then,
Skinhead.
and then the police started cracking down on both the bars and the people. I remember there would be police stopping the cars as they were going down, and pretty much the pressure kind of killed it a little bit.
Yeah, somebody mentioned the skinheads, but there were some incidents where there was some very kind of savage violence going on that was
Right.
prompted through this. The skinheads started to hang out there and make it their, became a kind of a den.
Yeah, there was that incident in the Gypsy Tea Room
Yeah.
where there was that sheriff that was permanently disabled after he was attacked.
Yeah.
So what about, say, in the 60s and 70s, what was Deep Ellum like? Pawn shops.
Yeah, it was kind of
Bars,
Nobody even went in with
It was pawn shops and clothing stores, secondhand clothing stores.
it was mostly light industrial, and then
Farther.
there were bars, but to my knowledge, it didn't really become kind of a hangout until the 80s.
Yeah.
And there were all the music clubs and whatnot, and that's when it really got its reputation as kind of prior, of course, in the early 20th century, it was a huge blues
Now, there's some
and
buildings
jazz.
down there that still have the factory, like the factory names. There was a hat
Uh-huh, Adam Hats.
Or like you said, it was kind of a light industry and manufacturing.
Right.
Well, you had Adams Factory was originally the Ford Motor Company.
Yes. Yes.
I have a Fair Park story. I was chairman of the Dallas Jewish Historical Society program, and this is about, 15 years ago. We decided to have a meeting down in Fair Park, in the Fair Park Hall. And as my host for the day was the person who was in charge of Fair Park. And he told me a story I still laugh at. It's so funny. The first president of the State Fair of Texas was a Jewish man. And Jews are involved in community work, so that was not unusual. And then he told me the rest of the story. He said they were always involved in developing areas of the city, particularly parks, and were interested in Fair Park. In 1936, which was the centennial of the state of Texas, Fort Worth wanted to have it in Fort Worth, and Boston wanted it because they were the capital of the state, and San Antonio said they were the oldest city, and Dallas got it because the Dallas Jewish bankers bankrolled the State Fair of Texas in 1936, and that's why we have it here. There was no other reason. Is that a story? And that's what we discovered in the Dallas Jewish Historical Society.
Oh, that's great.
A little comment on music. One of the greatest blues masters of all time, Robert Johnson.
Right.
He settled in Deep Ellum, did all his recording in downtown Dallas, and he only recorded 27 songs, and then he died very young, because he was in the wrong place, the wrong time, the wrong place.
Yeah, you recorded at the Warner Brothers.
Talking about his wife.
Oh,
At the Warner Brothers building, isn't that right?
Which building?
The old movie depository? Yeah.
There's someone over
In the
here.
1930s.
One industry you haven't really touched on, but you're gonna have to do it in your next book, is the apparel industry. And if it wasn't for 13 Jewish men, my father being one of them, there wouldn't have been the apparel mart as we knew it. Because they approached several builders, several architects. They had already outgrown the merchandise mart in downtown Dallas, as many of you might know. And so my father spearheaded a group of 12 other men, all Jewish businessmen that had showrooms there and wanted a new building. And they, like I said, they approached several men, and they all turned them down. They said, no, that's a silly idea, we don't need another building, etc. Anyway, Trammell Crow was the one who finally accepted. So they actually, those 13 men had a hand in helping to build and design what became the apparel mart.
Jill, what is your maiden name?
Pikowski.
Okay.
My father was Bill Pikowski.
Okay.
He was the children's man. That was his moniker. Yeah, so I mean, it's quite a story about the thousands of men who came here from New York to build up the apparel industry.
Well, thank you.
In doing your book, you said there's 95 entries. Obviously, over decades of material, how did you determine which 95 made it into the book? And were there some that maybe didn't get into the book?
Yeah, there were a lot that didn't make it. I tried to zero it down by things that I thought were not very well known. Like, one of the things that I originally wanted to include was the underground downtown, but I thought everyone knew about it. And as I was doing the book, it turns out that not very many people do know about it.
Only if you were from down.
What is that right?
Second story thing.
And another thing I learned too, there was I think it was 1908, there was a lynching at the courthouse. Like a whole mob thing.
Yeah, they're getting ready to put up a historical marker
Yeah,
about that right now.
yeah, just a terrible story, but I found that out afterwards. I don't remember the gentleman's name. He was a black man that was accused of rape. Yes, sir.
I'm not being born here, but you were mentioning something about the underground of Dallas. Are you saying it literally underground activity?
There is underground.
Could
Restaurants.
you expand on that just a little
The
bit?
main place.
Well, basically, from what I understand, it was built to escape the heat, and it's just underneath the buildings and the streets is like a mall. And there's restaurants, and there's drugstores, and other shops. And yeah, there isn't a whole lot. But yeah, you can walk the whole
There is.
path. It's kind of interesting.
You can still walk.
Yeah, one main place.
Yeah.
It's not a destination.
Now it is.
He didn't mention Riverside Park.
There are a lot, there are a lot of restaurants.
It's mostly fast food, isn't it?
The museum you talked about
Right.
at St. Anne's, is that open to the public?
Yeah, and it's free.
The samurai place?
So you can go there for brunch and then go upstairs.
St. Anne.
We live on the corner.
Where's this museum you're talking about?
It's at St. Anne's Restaurant and Bar. It's on Harry Hines.
Great park.
Harry Hines.
Museum is up there.
Yeah.
What's the weirdest thing that you found
I'm
out?
sorry?
What's the weirdest factoid that you found out? during the
Oh
course of
boy,
this.
weirdest. You know, to me, the weirdest thing, and or at least for me the most fascinating, was how they tried to turn the Trinity River into a seagoing waterway connecting Galveston to Dallas.
I understand there was one ship that made it.
Yeah, there was one boat and it took a year and 4 days. But they built these lock and dam systems up and down the river, well, in the northern part of the river, to deepen the waters. And then they abandoned the whole project before it was completed. So there's these like ruins of lock and dam systems up and down the river that you can go see.
Cockrell was the one, I forgot what her first name was, that built a navigation thing so they could get between Dallas and Oak Cliff when they had the floods. She had a ship line, went back and forth.
Oh, fair.
But can you imagine seeing cruise ships docking? It would be so weird.
I've read some Texas history in the past, and one thing that struck me was that everybody in that book, or these books, could not believe that a city was built in Dallas. That Dallas should not have been even existed, because it's in the middle of nowhere.
Right.
Can you
Well,
expand on that?
it was labeled in one book, a city that never should have been.
That's true.
It was
Except for the Jewish
Sanger Harris.
churches and stuff.
It was Sanger Harris,
Pastors
that's what
said, "We want a
happened.
city here."
Yeah.
And you know what else? No one knows how it got its name.
Yes,
Well, there's two different theories.
Two theories.
Yeah.
Vice president or someone.
No, the vice
friend,
president's not possible because the city was founded before he was vice president.
Yeah, but there was a friend of the founder that was named Dallas. That was how the city got it. Then the county named Dallas is named after the vice president. It was two different, they were named after two different people.
It was really the cotton industry that created
thought-
Dallas because it became a railroad stop for that.
I thought
well,
that
for the cotton.
Sanger Harris family and a couple others got the national government to move the railroads to cross in Dallas so they could build a general store to consolidate their business. And that was the origin of Dallas.
There were
That was
people
in
that did not want the
1872.
railroad to come to Dallas. So they said, what about the Browder Springs? Well, you know.
Right.
Oh, they said, oh,
That
that's
was city
fine, go to
limits.
Browder Springs.
It was ingenious.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Maybe they know this, but actually, Margot Jones, I'm sorry, was started the theater here, and it launched regional theaters throughout the United States. Regional theaters started in Dallas. Margot Jones.
They were in
And they
Fair
were-
Park.
in Fair Park. And there's also one named after her at SMU. But I forgot what the name of the building is now, but there's a building in Fair Park.
Oh, the Kalina Humphreys.
No.
Oh, in Fair Park.
Yeah, Fair Park, there is a little theater, Margot Jones. And that was where they launched it.
Do people have any idea that Union Station has train tracks where the trains used to come in underneath street level? Not just what we see now where DART and the TRE run and Amtrak. There are things going underneath all that area.
Well, there were railroad tracks underneath the Santa Fe complex.
The
Santa Fe building.
The Santa Fe building, I was down there one time.
Right, and there was a little steam tube locomotive that powered it.
But underneath Union Station there is, that's where the trains used to come in, below ground.
Yeah, they called it a water bottle locomotive, and they charged it up with steam because you couldn't have smoke underneath the building.
Does anybody else remember dancing in Union Station?
Any other questions?
Yes.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Mark. And thank you all for coming. We hope that you'll join us in March when we